Hello again. If you are here, you are in the right place tonight. Get comfortable. Pull the blankets up, dim whatever light you can reach, and let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on all day. You do not need to do anything else tonight except listen. That is the whole job. Listening and letting go. Here is a small taste of where we are going. You have just stepped into a ballroom in the most famous palace on earth. The chandeliers are blazing. The silk is catching candlelight in 100 small ways, and a young queen, barely more than a girl, is dancing across the floor, as though she has never known a single hour of doubt in her life. It looks, from where you are standing, like the absolute pinnacle of human comfort. And underneath that ballroom, in the dark, something is quietly leaking. Something that does not care about silk or chandeliers. Tonight, we are going there. We are going to Buckingham Palace in the earliest years of Queen Victoria's reign, when the most magnificent address in the world was, in ways that will surprise you, one of the unhealthiest places in England. Come with me. There is no rush. We have all night. Tonight we are going to follow the early years of Queen Victoria's life at Buckingham Palace, the palace she inherited as an 18-year-old girl in 1837, and the palace that, for the first decade of her reign, was quietly working against her. Not the fairy tale version, not the portrait version. The real one. The version most of us carry in our heads comes from paintings and films, kind of glossy, historical drama that shows candle-lit corridors and silk gowns, and never once shows what those corridors actually smelled like. We picture Buckingham Palace as it looks today, gleaming, solid, eternal, in the way that only a few buildings in the world manage to feel eternal. We assume that when Victoria moved in, she moved into comfort, into safety, into the finest home that the wealthiest empire on the planet could provide for its young queen. The truth is almost the opposite. When Victoria took up residence at Buckingham Palace, she moved into a building riddled with structural failure. Doors that would not close, windows that would not open, a drainage system built on top of ancient overflowing cesspools that had nowhere to drain, and no one, for years, willing to fix them. She moved into a palace where the air itself, in certain rooms, on certain days, was genuinely dangerous to breathe. And she moved into a palace so poorly secured that a 14-year-old boy could, and did, live inside its walls for days at a time without anyone noticing he was there. By the time we are finished tonight, you will understand something that the paintings never show you. That wealth and grandeur are not the same thing as safety. That the most photographed building in the world was once, for a period of years, something closer to a beautiful trap, and that surviving a night at Buckingham Palace in 1840 was not a matter of navigating the etiquette of the ballroom. It was a matter of surviving the building itself. Before we go any further, if this kind of evening suits you, if you like settling in with history that feels like a place you can visit, rather than a list to memorize, would you take a moment to subscribe? It costs nothing, but it helps more than you might think, and it means we can keep making these. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always read them. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Now, let us go to London. Let us go to the summer of 1837. A young queen has just inherited a throne and a palace, and neither of them are quite what they appear to be. It is July of 1837, and London in high summer carries a distinct thickness in the air, the smell of the Thames at low tide, mixing with coal smoke and horse dung, and the sweetish rot of a city that has grown too large, too fast, for the infrastructure beneath it. 2 million people now live within the reach of that smell, more than any city on the planet has ever held at once. And the Thames, which carries away most of what the city produces, is not equal to the tower. On a hot afternoon, the smell rolling off the river can be strong enough to make a person's eyes water from 100 yards away. Buckingham Palace sits at the western edge of this city, behind its wrought iron gates, its pale stone facade, catching the summer light in a way that suggests permanence, solidity, the settled confidence of an empire that believes itself unshakable. From the street, it looks finished, it looks complete, it looks in the way that grand buildings are designed to look, like something that has always been there and always will be. None of that is quite true. The building beneath that pale stone facade has a short, chaotic, and expensive history. And to understand what Victoria is walking into, you need to understand what came before her. The site began its royal life as a townhouse built for the Duke of Buckingham at the start of the 1700s, a handsome but modest residence by aristocratic standards. In 1761, King George III purchased it as a private home for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and for the better part of 60 years, it functioned as exactly that, a private house. Comfortable, well appointed, but never intended to be the official seat of the British monarchy. That role belonged to St. James's Palace, a few streets away, older and grander, and crucially, actually finished. Everything changed when George IV came to the throne in 1820. George was a man of enormous appetites and even more enormous debts, a king whose taste ran toward the theatrical and the expensive in roughly equal measure, and he decided that his mother's modest townhouse should become something worthy of an emperor. He hired the architect John Nash, a man of genuine talent and even more genuine extravagance, and together they set about transforming Buckingham House into Buckingham Palace. The numbers are worth pausing over because they tell you almost everything you need to know about what happened next. Parliament allocated £200,000 for what was described as repair and improvement. £200,000 in 1820 was already an almost unimaginable sum, enough to build several substantial townhouses with money left over. But George and Nash did not see £200,000 as a ceiling. They saw it as a starting point. By the time Parliament finally lost patience and forced an accounting, the costs had spiraled towards £700,000, and the palace was still nowhere near complete. Nash was dismissed in disgrace in 1830, blamed for the runaway expenses, though the truth is that he had simply been doing what George asked of him, which was to spend without limit on a vision that kept expanding faster than any budget could contain it. George himself died that same year, having never spent a single night the palace he had spent a fortune reimagining. His successor, William IV, inherited the unfinished project, and by most accounts, William found the palace gaudy, oversized, and impractical, and at one point he apparently offered it to Parliament as a replacement for the Houses of Parliament after they burned down in 1834, an offer. William never lived there either. He died in June of 1837, having spent his entire reign avoiding the very building his brother had spent a fortune constructing. Which brings us to Victoria. 18 years old. Crowned Queen with almost no warning, in the early hours of the 20th of June 1837, when a messenger arrived at Kensington Palace to inform her that her uncle William was dead, and the throne was hers. And within a matter of weeks, this teenage girl, who had grown up sheltered, isolated, and closely controlled by her mother and her mother's household, becomes the first monarch in history to actually move into Buckingham Palace. She arrives to find a building that is, in almost every practical sense, unfinished. Let us step back from the broad political history for a moment and look closely at what awaited her, because the details here are worth sitting with. This is one of those situations where the small facts tell a much bigger story than the grand narrative ever could. The palace that Victoria inherited had roughly 1,000 windows. A significant number of them did not open. This sounds like a minor inconvenience until you understand what it meant in practice. In a building with no mechanical ventilation, no air conditioning, nothing except the natural movement of air through open windows and chimneys to keep the atmosphere inside from growing stale, warm, and eventually dangerous. Doors throughout the building would not close properly, their frames warped or misaligned from construction that had been rushed, redone, and rushed again under the chaos of Nasher's ever-changing plans. Bells, the mechanical system by which servants throughout the vast building were summoned, frequently failed to ring, meaning that requests could go unanswered for reasons that had nothing to do with staff negligence and everything to do with a bell wire system. And there were no sinks on the bedroom floors. This detail alone tells you something important about the gap between the palace's appearance and its actual function. A building magnificent enough to host the crowned heads of Europe did not have the basic plumbing infrastructure to let its residents wash their hands without summoning a servant to carry water up several flights of stairs. The most alarming detail, though the one that would come to define the first decade of Victoria's residence in ways she could not have anticipated on the day she moved in, concerned the toilets. Hardly any of them were ventilated. We will return to exactly what that meant in detail, because it is the heart of tonight's story. But for now, understand this. Victoria moved into the grandest address in the British Empire, and the grandest address in the British Empire did not have properly working plumbing, properly closing doors, properly opening windows, or a properly functioning bell system. She moved into a palace that looked, from the outside, like the pinnacle of civilization, and that was, on the inside, still very much a construction site wearing a finished building's clothes. The human side of this chaos is just as revealing, the architecture, and it is where our story tonight really begins. By 1837, the staff of Buckingham Palace, numbered in the several hundreds, though almost no one, including the people theoretically in charge, could say exactly how many, doing exactly what, under whose authority. The organization of royal households in this era was a relic of centuries-old tradition, divided among several competing departments that answered to different superiors and rarely communicated with one another. The Lord Chamberlain's department controlled the staterooms. The Lord Steward's department controlled the kitchens and the wine cellars. The Master of the Horse controlled the stables. Critically, none of these departments had any real authority over the physical maintenance of the building itself, which meant that basic questions, who cleans this corridor, who is responsible for this broken window, who ensures that the coal is delivered before the fires go cold, went unanswered for years at a time, falling into the gaps between departments that had never been designed to speak to one another. This is where we meet the person whose eyes we will use to see this palace tonight. Her name, as best the fragmentary records of the period allow us to reconstruct her, was Sarah Winnicott. She is a composite figure built from the real housemaids, still roommaids, and junior servants who left behind traces in household accounts, wage books, and the occasional surviving letter from the earliest years of Victoria's reign. Sarah is 20 years old in the summer of 1837. She has been in service since she was 12, working her way up through smaller households in the countryside before securing, through a cousin already employed at the palace, her position as a housemaid in the newly staffed royal household. Sarah's world within the palace is defined almost entirely by the servants' quarters and the lower floors, the vast, largely invisible infrastructure that keeps the glittering staterooms above functioning. She rises before dawn. Her responsibilities include laying and lighting fires in a rotation of rooms, carrying water, emptying chamber pots, cleaning grates, and maintaining the endless, thankless battle against dust, soot, and grime that a building this size generates simply by existing. She sleeps in a shared attic room with 3 other housemaids, a space that is bitterly cold in winter and stifling in summer, furnished with narrow iron beds and little else. She has one small possession that matters to her beyond its practical use, a wooden sewing box that belonged to her mother, its lid carved with a simple pattern of leaves that has been worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside it, she keeps needles, thread, a few buttons, and a folded letter from her mother that she has read so many times the creases have begun to soften into tears. She mends her own clothing by candlelight in the rare hour before sleep, and there is something in the repetitive, careful work of it that settles her mind after the chaos of the day. And chaos is the correct word for what Sarah's daily life inside Buckingham Palace actually involves. Because in the summer of 1837, in the weeks immediately following the young Queen's arrival, the palace is by every account that survives in a state of genuine disorder. Let us walk through what that disorder actually looked like, because it is easy to say the word chaos and let it remain an abstraction. It was not abstract. It was specific, physical, and, in certain corners of the building, actively dangerous. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about what was actually happening beneath the floorboards of Buckingham Palace, because it is woven through everything we are about to watch, and it is far worse than most people imagine. Beneath the elegant staterooms, beneath the gilded ceilings and the silk-papered walls where the Queen received ambassadors and hosted balls, the palace sat on top of a network of cesspools that had been part of the site for generations. Inherited from the old Buckingham House and never properly modernized as the building above them grew larger and more elaborate. A cesspool, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is essentially a pit dug into the earth to collect human waste, sealed only partially, if at all, and requiring periodic emptying by hand. In a modest household, a cesspool might serve a handful of people and could be managed, however unpleasantly, with reasonable frequency. Beneath Buckingham Palace, the same basic system, largely unchanged in its fundamental design since the previous century, was being asked to serve a household that had grown to several hundred people. The system could not keep pace. The waste had nowhere adequate to go, and the drains connecting the palace's many toilets to the cesspools below were, as we have already noted, almost entirely unventilated. This is the detail that matters most, so let us sit with it. An unventilated drain does not simply fail to smell pleasant. It becomes a direct conduit, a kind of chimney running the wrong way, carrying the gases produced by decomposing waste, methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, directly up through the pipework and into the rooms above. There was nothing to stop it. No trap, no proper seal, no engineering solution standing between the Queen's household and the raw output of the cesspools beneath her feet. The result was a smell that the historical record describes again and again, in language that servants and courtiers alike found difficult to fully capture. The kitchens, situated on the lower floors closest to the source of the problem, were regularly overwhelmed. On bad days, and there were many bad days, the stench of raw sewage would rise up through the palace's floors and stairwells, with enough strength to reach the state dining rooms above, drifting into the very spaces where the Queen entertained foreign dignitaries over course after course of elaborately prepared food. Imagine that specific collision for a moment. Candlelight, crystal, the finest china in England. And beneath it all, working its way up through the floorboards, the unmistakable smell of a system that was failing exactly where it needed most to succeed. This is not a metaphor, and it deserves to be said plainly. The palace was in the most literal sense possible, suffocating its own inhabitants with the byproducts of its own waste. Sarah and the other servants who worked closest to the kitchens and the lower service corridors lived inside this smell for hours at a stretch, developing, as people do, a kind of numbed tolerance that the Queen and her courtiers, who encountered it only in occasional, overpowering waves, never had the chance to build. But numb tolerance is not the same as safety. The gases produced by decomposing sewage are not merely unpleasant. Insufficient concentration in an enclosed space with poor air circulation. They are toxic in real concentrations, capable of causing headaches, nausea, and in extreme cases, far worse. The servants who spent their working lives in the palace's lower floors were, without anyone fully understanding it at the time, being subjected to a low chronic level of exposure that the wealthy, entitled inhabitants above them would have found utterly intolerable had they been forced to endure it themselves. And the sewage was only half of the problem. The other half came from a source that was, at the time, considered the very height of modern progress: gas lighting. Buckingham Palace, like many grand buildings of the era, had begun installing coal gas lamps in an effort to modernize its lighting, moving away from the older systems of candles and oil lamps toward the brighter, more consistent illumination that gas could provide. In theory, this was an improvement. In practice, in a building with the ventilation problems Buckingham Palace already suffered from, it introduced an entirely new category of danger. Coal gas, produced by heating coal in the absence of oxygen, is a mixture of several different compounds, including hydrogen, methane, and, critically, carbon monoxide. It is combustible, which is precisely why it was useful for lighting, but it is also toxic when it leaks unburned into an enclosed space, and the gas piping systems of the 1830 seconds and 1840 seconds were by any modern standard. Joints were sealed imperfectly. Pipes ran through walls and beneath floors where a slow leak might go undetected for weeks. And in a palace where entire rooms could not be properly ventilated, where windows would not open, and the natural circulation of air had already been compromised by decades of hasty construction, any gas that leaked had nowhere to go. The lamps themselves, even when functioning correctly, presented their own quieter danger. Burning coal gas produces soot, a fine oily black residue that settles on every surface within reach, and in the staterooms of Buckingham Palace, that meant settling on ceilings that had been painted by some of the finest decorative artists in Europe, on gilded moldings that had cost fortunes to install, on silk wall coverings imported at extraordinary expense. The palace's own modernization was, quite literally, blackening itself from the inside, layer by layer, lamp by lamp, in rooms that were too poorly ventilated to clear the smoke away. There is more to understand here, because the gas and the sewage were not the palace's only atmospheric failures. There was also the matter of heat, or rather the persistent and maddening absence of it. The great fireplaces of Buckingham Palace, the enormous hearths designed to warm rooms of true palatial scale, suffered from a design flaw that seems almost comic in its cruelty until you consider what it actually meant to live with. Rather than drawing air upward and out through the chimney, carrying smoke away as a properly functioning fireplace should, many of the palace's chimneys did the opposite. They drew air downward. The precise engineering reasons for this varied from chimney to chimney, related to the height and placement of the flues, the surrounding architecture, and the general haste with which so much of the building had been constructed and reconstructed under Nash's chaotic supervision. But the practical effect was consistent and miserable. When servants lit the great fires in an attempt to warm the staterooms, smoke did not rise obediently up the chimney out into the London sky. It billowed back down into the room, filling the air with a choking grey haze that stung the eyes and coated the throat. The solution, more often than not, was to let the fires die down before they had properly warmed the room, trading smoke for cold, because a slowly dying fire that produced less smoke was judged more tolerable than a roaring one that filled the room with fumes, which meant that Buckingham Palace, despite its enormous fireplaces and its seemingly endless supply of coal, was frequently, stubbornly, bitterly cold. Courtiers wrote of shivering through state occasions in their finest silks. Victoria herself, in later years, would recall the persistent chill of those early rooms with something approaching disbelief that anyone had been expected to simply endure it. So picture the totality of what Sarah moves through each day, and what the Queen herself breathes each night. A palace where the lower floors reek of raw sewage rising through unventilated drains, where newly installed gas lamps leak invisible, toxic fumes into rooms that cannot properly clear the air, where the very act of lighting a fire for warmth fills the room with choking smoke instead, and where, despite all of this, the building must still function as the ceremonial heart of an empire, hosting balls and state dinners, and the endless performance of wealth and power that the British monarchy requires of itself. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. The comfortable image of Victorian grandeur, the chandeliers, the silk, the gleaming surfaces, existed in the same physical space as an atmosphere that was, in the most direct sense, working against the health of everyone who breathed it. Let us return to Sarah, because it is deep into one specific evening in the autumn of 1837, and the palace, as it so often does, is about to remind everyone within its walls exactly how unfinished it truly is. It is October, and the evening has settled into the specific cold that October evenings in London specialize in. A damp chill that seems to come from the stone itself rather than merely the air. Sarah's day began, as it always does, before 5 in the morning, when she and the other housemaids rose in the dark of their shared attic room and dressed quickly in the cold, their breath visible even indoors before making their way down the narrow back stairs. Her first task of the day, as it has been every day since she arrived, is fires. Dozens of grates throughout the palace's lower and middle floors require cleaning, laying, and lighting before the household properly wakes, and Sarah moves through her assigned rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that her hands have learned to work faster than her conscious mind can direct them. Kneel. Clear the old ash into the bucket. Lay the kindling in its careful pyramid. Add the coal. Strike the light. Watch to be sure it catches before moving to the next room. Repeat in room after room until the grey light of dawn finally reaches the windows that do open. By the time the sun is fully up, Sarah has moved on to water carrying, one of the most physically punishing tasks in her daily rotation. Because so few of the palace's upper floors have proper plumbing, water for washing must be carried up from the lower levels in heavy jugs, climbing flight after flight of the narrow back stairs that servants are required to use. Stairs deliberately hidden from the grand public staircases so that the machinery of the household remains invisible to anyone important enough to notice it. Her arms ache by mid-morning in a way that has become so familiar She barely registers it as pain anymore, simply as the ordinary texture of her days. The Queen herself, Sarah understands only distantly, at a remove appropriate to her station. She has glimpsed Victoria perhaps a handful of times since the young Queen's arrival in July, always from a respectful distance, always in the brief moment when a housemaid's presence in a corridor happens to coincide with the Queen's passage through it, at which point Sarah, like every other servant, is trained to make herself as invisible as possible. Eyes down, back against the wall, waiting for the Queen and her attendants to pass. It is a strange kind of intimacy, living inside the same walls as the most famous young woman in the world, while remaining, to her, essentially invisible. What Sarah knows about the Queen, she knows, secondhand, filtered through the constant, low murmur of servant gossip that flows through the palace's lower corridors like its own kind of circulatory system. She has heard that Victoria is spirited, quicker-tempered than her public image might suggest, fiercely protective of the small amount of independence her new position has finally granted her after a childhood spent under her mother's close and controlling supervision. She has heard that the Queen dances beautifully, that she has thrown herself into the social whirl of her new role with an appetite that suggests years of enforced quiet finally breaking loose. And she has heard, more than once, whispered in the kitchens with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern, that the Queen has complained about the cold in her own apartments, about drafts that no amount of fire tending seems able to fully banish. This October evening, Sarah's rotation brings her to the corridor outside one of the smaller staterooms, tasked with maintaining the fire, in preparation for a modest evening gathering the Queen is hosting for a handful of her closest attendants and a few members of the diplomatic corps. She kneels at the hearth, feeding the flames with the careful attention her training has instilled in her, and it is here, in this ordinary moment of ordinary work, that she first properly registers the smell. It arrives gradually, the way bad smells so often do. A faint wrongness at the edge of her awareness that grows, over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, into something impossible to ignore. It is not wood smoke, though wood smoke is also present, curling faintly back into the room from a chimney that is once again failing to draw properly. It is something else entirely, a heavy organic foulness that Sarah recognizes immediately, because she has smelled it many times before in the lower service corridors closer to the kitchens, but that she has never before encountered this close to a room where the Queen herself is expected to receive guests within the hour. She reports it, as her training instructs her to the more senior housemaid, overseeing her section of the household that evening, a woman named Miss Hargreaves, who has served in the palace since the days of William IV, and who receives the news with the weary, resigned expression of someone who has heard this particular report many times before, and expects to hear it many times again. There is nothing to be done, Mrs. Hargreaves tells her, beyond airing the room as best they can and hoping the Queen's guests are too well-mannered to comment. The drains, she explains, in the flat, practical tone of someone long past outrage, have backed up again. It happens with some regularity, particularly after heavy rain, when the ancient cesspools beneath the palace's foundations, already straining under a burden they were never designed to carry, simply have nowhere left for their contents to go. Sarah spends the next half hour doing what little can actually be done. She opens the room's single functioning window as wide as it will go, letting in the cold October air in an attempt to dilute the smell with something, anything, cleaner. She burns a small quantity of dried lavender and rosemary on a dish near the hearth, an old household remedy for unpleasant odors that does little to address the actual source of the problem, but provides at least a competing scent for the nose to focus on. She works quickly and quietly, aware that the Queen's guests are due to arrive within the hour, and that whatever solution exists must be in place by then. It is not, in the end, a solution. 'Tis a mitigation, a small effort to make an intolerable situation slightly more tolerable, and Sarah understands, even as she works, that this is essentially the nature of her entire job. Within this palace, she is not fixing the building. No one currently employed within its walls has the authority, the resources, or, frankly, the clear understanding of the problem required to actually fix the building. She is simply managing its failures, one evening, one room, one small crisis at a time, in the gap between what the palace is supposed to be and what it actually is. The Queen's small gathering proceeds that evening largely as planned. Sarah, from her position in the corridor, catches only fragments of it: the murmur of conversation, the occasional ripple of laughter, the specific quality of candlelight spilling out beneath the door. Whether the Queen or her guests noticed the smell that Sarah spent the better part of an hour trying to disguise, she never learns. It is not the kind of thing that would be reported back to a housemaid. But she thinks about it, later, lying in her narrow attic bed with the cold pressing in through walls that were never properly finished, about the strange, quiet absurdity of an empire's grandest palace fighting a losing battle against its own plumbing. Now, here is where most people get the story of early Buckingham Palace wrong. They imagine that the danger to the young Queen, if there was any danger at all, must have come from something grand and dramatic: a political conspiracy, an assassination plot hatched by enemies of the crown. The truth is stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling, because the greatest security failure of Victoria's early reign at Buckingham Palace came not from a calculated enemy, but from the simple, almost accidental fact. Let us walk through what palace security actually looked like in these years, because the gap between the image and the reality is once again considerable. In theory, Buckingham Palace was protected by 3 overlapping layers: military sentinels provided by whichever regiment held guard duty that season stood at formal posts around the building's exterior. The palace maintained its own staff of liveried porters, servants specifically tasked with monitoring entrances and receiving visitors. The local police provided a small corps of constables, supervised by a duty inspector, who patrolled the grounds and immediate surroundings. In practice, these 3 systems rarely communicated with one another, operated under different chains of command, and left significant gaps in coverage that anyone with sufficient patience and a working knowledge of the building's layout could exploit. Doors on the ground floor were frequently left unlocked. Windows, including the many that would not properly close, offered points of entry that required no special skill to use. And the sheer scale of the building, its endless corridors and half-finished wings and rooms that even senior staff sometimes struggled to keep track of, meant that a person who managed to get inside could, with a bit of luck and a great deal of nerve, remain undetected for an extraordinary length of time. This is where our story takes its strangest turn, because in December of 1838, roughly a year and a half after Victoria's arrival, the palace's security failures produced one of the most bizarre episodes in the entire history of the British monarchy. His name was Edward Jones. History would come to know him simply as the Boy Jones, and at the time of his first documented break-in, he was 14 years old. Jones was, by every account that survives, an unremarkable boy from an unremarkable London family, the son of a tailor. With no special education, no clear prospects, and as it would turn out, an entirely singular and inexplicable fixation on the young Queen, the palace she called home. On the morning of the 14th of December 1838, at 5 o'clock, a night porter named William Cox discovered him inside Buckingham Palace having apparently gained entry through an unlocked door or an unshuttered ground floor window. Jones was covered in soot and what the records describe as bear's grease, leading palace staff to initially assume he had climbed down through a chimney, an assumption that added an almost comic touch of absurdity to what was, underneath the strangeness, a deeply alarming security breach. When searched, Jones was found in possession of a regimental sword, several pairs of the Queen's undergarments, 3 pairs of trousers, some foreign coins, and a small portrait of Victoria herself. He had, by his own account, by the physical evidence discovered on his person, spent an unknown amount of time simply moving through the palace's staterooms, its corridors, and its private chambers, treating the building, in the words later used by one historian who researched his case extensively. When questioned, Jones gave a false name, claiming to be Edward Cotton, the son of a tradesman. The deception did not hold for long. He was brought before the authorities, and in the strange legal framework of the time, his offense, though deeply alarming from a security standpoint, did not technically qualify as a felony under the specific laws governing trespass onto royal property. He was tried, initially, before the Privy Council itself, in a proceeding kept largely secret from the public, and he was ultimately acquitted, the jury apparently unable or unwilling to convict him of anything more serious than the loosely defined offense of being a rogue and vagabond, for which he received a modest sentence. He did not stop. This is the part of the story that deserves both a moment of genuine dark humor and immediately afterward the weight it actually carries, because what followed Jones's first arrest reveals something far more troubling about the true state of palace security than his initial break-in alone. In November of 1840, nearly 2 years after his first arrest and only 10 days after Victoria, now married to Prince Albert, had given birth to her first child, daughter also named Victoria, Jones broke into the palace again. This time, he scaled the surrounding wall near Constitution Hill, made his way inside without detection, and by his own later account, simply left again after some period of unmonitored wandering, taking nothing, leaving no immediate trace of his presence. 2 days later, he came back. Shortly after midnight on the 1st of December 1840, the Queen's governess and close companion, Baroness Louise Lazen, discovered him hiding beneath a sofa in the Queen's own dressing room. In the private dressing room of the Queen of England, 10 days after she had given birth, in a palace theoretically protected by soldiers, porters, and police, Jones had, by this point, been inside the building on at least 3 separate documented occasions, had stolen the Queen's undergarments, had reportedly sat upon the throne itself, and had on this final visit positioned himself close enough to the Queen's most private quarters to hide beneath furniture she used daily. Let us pause on what this actually means, stripped of its strange, almost comic details, because underneath the absurdity of a teenage boy stuffing royal underwear down his trousers lies a deeply frightening truth. If a 14-year-old boy with no training, no resources, and no clear plan beyond his own peculiar fixation could move through Buckingham Palace undetected for days at a time, entering and exiting essentially at will, then the palace offered no meaningful protection against anyone with more serious intentions. A determined assassin, a foreign agent, anyone willing to exploit the same unlocked doors and unshuttered windows that Jones had exploited purely out of a strange, obsessive curiosity. The boy Jones was, in the end, sent into the Navy, in what amounted to an attempt by the authorities to remove him from London and from temptation entirely. He served aboard several ships before eventually deserting, making his way back toward London, and being caught again before he could complete whatever journey he had intended. He would later emigrate to Australia, where accounts describe a difficult, troubled life before disappearing from the historical record sometime in the final decade of the 19th century. But the disease that mattered was not really Jones himself. it was what his case revealed. That the young queen, sleeping in her private apartments in the most famous building in her kingdom, had been for years essentially unprotected, not from grand political conspiracies, but from the simple, mundane failure of a household too disorganized to lock its own doors. And the filth and the intruders were not the only things hiding inside Buckingham Palace's walls. There was a slower, quieter danger too, one that would not announce itself the way a 14-year-old boy hiding beneath a sofa announces itself, but that carried consequences reaching further than anyone in 1840 could have imagined. The unsanitary conditions we have spent this evening walking through, the failed drains, the overflowing cesspools, the sewage gas rising up through unventilated pipes into rooms where the royal family lived and slept and raised their children, were not merely unpleasant. They were, in the specific medical language of waterborne and airborne disease, a persistent risk that the palace's grandeur did nothing whatsoever to mitigate. The same broken infrastructure that Sarah fought against with lavender and open windows was over years of continuous exposure, quietly working against the health of everyone who lived within the palace's walls, servant and royal alike. We will return to this thread later in our evening together, because it connects, in a way that still unsettles historians today, to the eventual fate of the man who would finally take this crumbling, beautiful, dangerous building in hand. We should step back now and ask the question that the entire first years of Victoria's residence had been building toward, unanswered and unaddressed. If the palace was this disordered, this poorly managed, this structurally unsound, who, if anyone, was going to fix it? The answer, when it finally arrived, came not from Parliament, not from the aging bureaucracy of the royal household, but from a 20-year-old German prince who married into the family in February of 1840 and who would spend much of the next 2 decades quietly, methodically, and at times ruthlessly rebuilding the very foundations of how Buckingham Palace actually functioned. His name was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and his arrival marks the turning point in tonight's story. Albert arrived in England as a young man of quiet intelligence, formal manners, and a temperament that many English courtiers initially found stiff, foreign, and difficult to warm to. He was Victoria's first cousin, raised in the small German duchy of Saxe-Coburg, educated with a thoroughness and seriousness that stood in sharp contrast to the looser, more socially oriented education typical of English aristocracy. He had been groomed from an early age by his uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, for exactly the role he was now stepping into, and he arrived with a mind trained to notice systems, structures, and the gap between how an institution was supposed to function. It did not take him long to notice Buckingham Palace's gap. In the early months of the marriage, Albert found himself in a position that many historians have since described with a kind of wry sympathy. He was the husband of the Queen of England, and yet he held, in the eyes of both the Constitution and the deeply entrenched royal household, almost no formal authority whatsoever. Victoria, fiercely protective of her own independence after a childhood spent under her mother's controlling supervision, was initially reluctant to grant her new husband any real influence over the running of her household. Albert spent his first months at Buckingham Palace largely as an observer, a man of considerable intelligence and organizational instinct, forced to watch from the sidelines as a household he could see was badly broken. But observation, for a mind like Albert's, was its own kind of preparation. He began, quietly and methodically, cataloging the specific failures of the palace's management, not merely the physical infrastructure, but the human systems layered on top of it, the same competing departments and unclear lines of authority that had left Sarah's world, and the world of every servant like her. The moment that finally granted Albert the standing to act came in a strange twist of timing from the very security failures we have just spent this evening examining. The ease with which the boy Jones had repeatedly infiltrated the palace, culminating in his discovery beneath the Queen's own sofa just 10 days after the birth of the royal couple's first child, created a level of public and political alarm that finally overcame the inertia of the existing household structure. If a teenager with no resources could move through the palace at will, something had to change, and Albert, already positioned as the household's most careful observer, was the natural candidate to lead that change. What followed, over the course of the next several years, was one of the more remarkable behind-the-scenes transformations in the history of the British monarchy, and it is worth walking through in some detail, because the story of how Albert fixed Buckingham Palace. Albert began with the household's chaotic administrative structure, the same tangle of competing departments, the Lord Chamberlain's office, the Lord Steward's office, the Master of the Horse, that had left basic maintenance questions unanswered for years. He identified the role of Master of the Household, an existing position that had, until this point, carried relatively little real power, and he began systematically expanding its authority, consolidating responsibility for the domestic staff, the kitchens, the cleaning, and the general physical management of the palace under a single accountable office. Where previously a broken window or a backed-up drain might sit unaddressed for weeks because no department wanted to claim responsibility for the expense of fixing it, Albert's reform structure created a clear chain of command, a single person whose job it was to know what was broken and to see it fixed. This sounds, described in these plain, administrative terms, almost dry. It was not dry to Sarah, and it was not dry to the hundreds of servants like her, whose daily working conditions were transformed by these changes in ways both large and small. The endless confusion over which department was responsible for which task, confusion that had often meant work, went undone simply because no one had been clearly assigned to do it, began to clear. Supplies that had previously run short because purchasing authority was scattered across multiple competing offices began arriving reliably. The bells that summoned servants, so notoriously unreliable in the palace's earliest years, were finally properly repaired, part of a broader push to address the physical infrastructure failures that Albert catalogued with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. And then there was the plumbing, the specific foundational problem that had defined the palace's earliest and most unpleasant years. Albert commissioned a genuine engineering overhaul of the palace's drainage system, bringing in the kind of technical expertise that the previous decade's patchwork management had never properly employed. The ancient cesspools that had strained under the weight of a household grown far beyond their original design were finally, systematically, addressed, dug out, reconstructed, and connected to improved drainage that could actually carry waste away from the building. The unventilated drains that had turned the palace's plumbing into a direct conduit for toxic sewage gas were reworked with proper ventilation and sealing, closing off the pathway that had, for years, allowed the building's waste to rise up and mingle with the air its residents breathed. The gas lighting system received similar attention, its leaking joints repaired, its ventilation improved, reducing, though never entirely eliminating, the risk that had accompanied the palace's earlier hasty modernization. And the chimneys, those maddening flues that drew smoke downward instead of up, were investigated and, where possible, corrected, part of a broader effort to finally make the palace's fires provide warmth instead of misery. None of this happened overnight. Albert's reforms unfolded across years, not months, a patient, methodical campaign against decades of accumulated neglect. And Sarah, watching it unfold from her position within the household's working ranks, experienced it not as a single dramatic transformation. The smell that had once risen up through the kitchen floors grew less frequent, then rarer still. The bitter cold that had defined her first winters in the palace's service began gradually to yield to fires that actually warmed the rooms they were lit in. The chaos of unclear authority, the endless confusion over who was responsible for what, began to resolve into something closer to an actual system. There is a sharp irony worth sitting with here, one that connects the beginning of tonight's story to its end, and it deserves the weight of its own telling. The man who spent years of his life dragging Buckingham Palace out of its own filth, who dug out its cesspools, rebuilt its drains, reorganized its household, and fought a slow, patient war against decades of neglect, would eventually die of a disease intimately connected to exactly the kind of sanitation failure he had spent his adult life correcting. In early December of 1861, Prince Albert fell ill at Windsor Castle, the royal family's other great residence outside London, a building that, despite decades of use, suffered from its own persistent sanitation problems that Albert himself, by most accounts, had never managed to fully resolve in the way he had at Buckingham Palace. His symptoms began vaguely. Insomnia, aches in his arms and legs, a general creeping loss of appetite and vitality that alarmed those closest to him without, at first, pointing clearly toward any specific diagnosis. By the 7th of December, his physician, Sir William Jenner, one of the era's foremost authorities on the disease, noted the appearance of a telltale rose-colored rash across Albert's skin, typhoid fever. The diagnosis that would come to define the final days of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades fighting exactly the conditions that typhoid thrives in. The disease is caused by a specific bacterium transmitted through water or food contaminated by the waste of an infected person. A mechanism of transmission that traces a direct, almost unbearably poetic line back to the same broken drainage. To fully address at Windsor, he died on the 14th of December 1861 in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle with Victoria and several of their children at his bedside. He was 42 years old. It is worth pausing here to be honest about what we actually know, because the historical record is more complicated than the simple, tidy irony might suggest. Modern medical historians examining Albert's case have raised genuine questions about whether typhoid was truly the cause of his death, or whether his physicians, working with the limited diagnostic tools of their era, may have misread a longer, more chronic illness, possibly something that medicine in 1861 had no name for at all. Albert had suffered from persistent stomach troubles for at least 2 years before his death, a detail that some modern researchers argue points toward a different underlying condition entirely. But whether or not typhoid was the precise, final cause, the broader truth remains, and it is the truth that matters most for tonight's story. Albert's own son, the future King Edward VII, would himself contract typhoid a decade later, a case that very nearly killed him and that reinforced, for a generation of royal physicians, just how persistently dangerous the sanitation at the royal residences remained. The man who had fixed Buckingham Palace's plumbing had married into a family and a set of buildings whose relationship with clean water and functioning drains remained fraught for decades after his death. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, tucked away behind the grander, more familiar narrative of Albert as the great modernizer, the prince who brought order to a chaotic monarchy. He did bring that order. But the very forces he spent his life correcting, the invisible, unglamorous, deeply unroyal problem of where waste goes and what happens when it has nowhere to go, may well have been the thing that finally caught up with him. Let us zoom out now, because there is one more thread to this story, and it reaches all the way from Victoria's velvet-draped ballrooms to a headline you may have seen in the news quite recently. The specific structural flaws that plagued Buckingham Palace in the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds. The outdated wiring, the aging pipes, the persistent dampness that no amount of Victorian-era repair work ever fully banished from a building this old never entirely went away. They were patched, repaired, modernized in fits and starts across nearly 2 centuries, each generation addressing the most urgent problems of its own era while leaving deeper structural issues for the next generation to inherit. And in the 21st century, those inherited issues finally became too significant to patch around any longer. Buckingham Palace is currently in the midst of a 10-year renovation program, budgeted at £369 million, replacing electrical wiring, lead pipes, and heating systems that in some cases had not been meaningfully updated since the 1950 seconds. It is, in its own modern language of budgets and infrastructure reports, essentially the same battle that Albert fought in the 1840 seconds. An aging building whose grandeur has always outpaced its plumbing, still working, nearly 2 centuries later, to keep the water flowing where it should. The scale of this modern undertaking gives some sense of just how persistent the underlying problem truly is. Miles of cabling, much of it original to installations decades old, are being stripped out and replaced. A project significant enough that entire sections of the palace have needed to be vacated for years at a stretch. Reports examining the building's condition before this program began described risks that, in their own modern engineering language, echo uncomfortably with the dangers Sarah and her fellow servants once navigated daily. Fire risk from wiring never designed to carry the electrical load a modern household requires. Water damage from pipes original to an era before anyone fully understood how to properly waterproof a building of this scale and age. The specific technologies have changed almost beyond recognition since 1840, but the fundamental vulnerability, a magnificent structure whose hidden infrastructure has simply grown too old to trust, remains exactly the same story, wearing modern clothes. King Charles has announced that he will not return to live at Buckingham Palace even after the renovation concludes, choosing instead to remain at the smaller, more manageable Clarence House, a decision that royal watchers have connected, at least in part, to the sheer scale of what it takes to keep a building this old, this large, and this historically neglected, properly fit for daily living. The palace will remain the ceremonial heart of the monarchy, the building where the world watches the royal family appear on the balcony, but it will no longer, for the foreseeable future, be anyone's actual home. There is something almost fitting in that, if you sit with it long enough. The most famous address in the world, built to project permanence and grandeur to every visitor who ever stood outside its gates, has spent nearly 200 years quietly, persistently, structurally able to fully deliver on the promise of its own facade. Let's return one final time to Sarah, because her story, small and largely unrecorded as it is, gives us something the grand historical narrative cannot. A sense of what it actually felt like to live inside this transformation, year after year, as the palace slowly, unevenly, became less of a beautiful trap and more of an actual home. By 1845, Sarah has been in service at Buckingham Palace for 8 years. She is no longer the 20-year-old housemaid who first reported a sewage smell to Mrs. Hargreaves on a cold October evening. She has been promoted gradually through the household's internal hierarchy and now holds a position with somewhat greater responsibility, overseeing a small team of junior maids in the maintenance of several of the palace's guest apartments. Her hands, which once ached constantly from carrying water up flights of narrow back stairs, have grown accustomed to the work in the way that bodies do, the specific exhaustion of her earliest years settling into something closer to routine. The palace around her has changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. The drains no longer fail. with the grim regularity she remembers from her first years of service. There are still bad days, still moments when an old pipe, somewhere in the building's vast aging infrastructure, reminds everyone of what lies beneath the gilded surfaces. But they are rare now, infrequent enough that when they happen, they are treated as genuine emergencies. The gas lamps burn more reliably, their leaks patched, their soot output reduced by better maintenance and improved fittings. The fires in most of the rooms she oversees actually warm the spaces they are lit in, drawing smoke properly up through chimneys that have finally been corrected. She has, over these years, glimpsed the royal family with somewhat greater frequency than in those distant early days, not through any change in her own status, which remains modestly fixed within the household's rigid hierarchy, but simply through the accumulated familiarity of 8 years spent moving through the same corridors. The same building that has slowly become, for her as much as for the Queen, something closer to an actual home rather than a beautiful, half-finished construction site. She remembers with a clarity that surprises her the specific quality of relief she felt the first winter she noticed the fires no longer filled the staterooms with smoke. It was such a small thing in the scheme of a life, a single winter's fires burning cleanly rather than choking the room with grey haze, and yet it had struck her, in that moment, as something worth marking. Evidence, however modest, that the chaos she had accepted as simply the nature of this place was not, in fact, permanent. That someone, somewhere in the vast machinery above her, had finally decided that the problem was worth fixing, and had possessed the authority, the patience, to actually fix it. She thinks of Prince Albert, on the rare occasions she has cause to think of him at all, with a kind of distant, practical gratitude that has nothing to do with politics or royal deference and everything to do. Her hands are less cracked from cold water now. Her lungs no longer burn from wood smoke on winter evenings. The building she spends most of her waking hours inside no longer actively works against her comfort and her health, in quite the way it once did. Whatever else Prince Albert may or may not have accomplished in the grander sweep of history, Sarah knows, in the specific, embodied way that only years of physical labor can teach a person, that he made her world measurably, tangibly better. Let us step back now and look at what this whole story reveals, because there are patterns here worth naming, patterns that stretch far beyond one palace, one queen, and one German prince with a talent for organization. The first pattern is the gap between appearance and infrastructure, and it is, perhaps, the central truth of everything we have discussed tonight. Buckingham Palace in 1837 looked, from every angle a visitor might approach it, like the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, a building designed specifically to project permanence, wealth, and civilizational triumph to everyone who beheld it. And underneath that facade, the building could not reliably keep its own waste contained, could not properly light itself without risk of toxic leakage, could not warm itself without choking its occupants with smoke. The gap between how a structure of power presents itself and how it actually functions is across history consistently wider than we assume, and Buckingham Palace offers one of the more vivid illustrations of exactly how wide that gap can grow. The second pattern is the invisible labor that makes grandeur possible. Every gleaming surface Victoria's guests admired at her balls, every warm room they sat in, every meal that reached the state dining room without the accompanying stench of the kitchens below, existed because people like Sarah spent their days performing an endless, largely unrecorded battle against the building's failures. Their names rarely survive in the historical record. Their labor, invisible by design, is precisely what allowed the visible performance of monarchy to continue functioning at all. The third pattern is the specific, stubborn, persistence of infrastructure problems across time. The dampness, the aging pipes, the wiring, never quite brought fully up to the standard of its own era. These are not problems Albert solved once and for all in the 1840 seconds. They are problems that every subsequent generation of palace administrators has had to address, again in their own context with their own technology, because a building this old expanded and modified so many times across so many centuries never stops accumulating new versions of the same fundamental challenge. The £369 million renovation currently underway is not a departure from Albert's work. It is a continuation of it, the same basic project, updated for a new century's materials and a new century's expectations. The fourth pattern, and perhaps the one that lingers longest, is the specific loneliness of being surrounded by magnificence that cannot actually meet your basic needs. Victoria, in her earliest years at Buckingham Palace, was, by any honest measure, one of the most powerful people on the planet, sovereign of an empire that spanned continents, and she spent her first winters there, shivering in rooms too cold to properly warm, breathing air that carried, on bad days, the smell of her own palace's failing plumbing. Power and comfort are not the same thing. Wealth and safety are not the same thing. The young queen learned this lesson in the most direct way imaginable, through her own cold hands and her own complaints about draughts that no fire seemed able to fully banish. Let us return, before we close this evening, to the scene we opened with. A ball at Buckingham Palace in the spring of 1840, not long before Albert's reforms had truly taken hold, when the palace's grandeur and its dysfunction still existed side by side in the same rooms, at the same hour, for the same guests. Sarah is not present in the ballroom itself, of course. Her work that evening keeps her in the corridors, service passages that thread invisibly behind the grand public spaces, carrying trays, replenishing candles, responding to the small constant demands that a gathering of this scale generates behind its glittering surface. But she catches glimpses through half-open doors and along the edges of her assigned route of the scene unfolding within. The ballroom that evening is lit by hundreds of candles, their flames multiplied and scattered by crystal chandeliers into a warm, shifting glow that catches every surface in the room. The gilded moldings along the ceiling, the silk of the ladies' gowns, the polished floor reflecting it all back upward in a soft golden blur. An orchestra plays from a gallery at one end of the room, the music rising and falling through the formal patterns of a quadrille, and beneath it the low, continuous murmur of several hundred conversations, punctuated by laughter, by the specific rustle of silk moving against silk as couples turn through the dance. Victoria, 20 years old this spring, moves through the ballroom with an energy that her attendants have come to recognize as genuine delight rather than mere performance. She loves to dance, has always loved it, and something in the freedom of the ballroom, the temporary suspension of the endless formal obligations that otherwise structure nearly every hour of her day, seems to let her set down, briefly, the enormous weight of being sovereign of an empire. She wears silk in a pale shade that catches the candlelight beautifully, jewels at her throat and in her hair, and to anyone watching from across the room, she is, in this moment, the living embodiment of everything the word palace is meant to conjure. Wealth, youth, power, grace. This is the image that survives in the portraits, in the later films and television dramas that would eventually try to capture this era, in the popular imagination's shorthand for what it meant to be young and royal in early Victorian England. And it is not false, exactly. The silk was real, the music was real, the candlelight, the jewels, the genuine pleasure on the young queen's face as she moved through the dance. All of it was real. But Sarah, moving along the service corridor, just beyond the ballroom's grand doors, carrying a tray of refreshments toward a side table where footmen will distribute them among the guests, catches something else in the air of that corridor, something that has nothing to do with silk or candlelight. A faint but unmistakable trace, carried up from the lower floors through a stretch of plumbing that has not yet received Albert's full attention, of the same problem that has plagued this building since before Victoria ever set foot inside it. It is fainter than it once was, diluted by the improvements already underway, but it is there, threading invisibly through the same air that carries the orchestra's music and the murmur of several hundred delighted conversations. She thinks nothing of it particularly, beyond the automatic, practiced awareness of a housemaid whose job includes monitoring exactly this kind of failure. She continues along her route, delivers her tray, and returns to whatever task awaits her next. But if you could pause that moment, hold it still, the way memory sometimes holds a single frame from a much longer sequence of events, you would see the entire truth of Buckingham Palace in the 1,840 seconds captured. Silk and sewage sharing the same room, candlelight and coal gas sharing the same ceiling, a queen dancing in genuine, unguarded happiness, 3 floors above a system of cesspools straining under a burden it was never designed to carry. That is what surviving a night at Buckingham Palace actually meant in these years. Not navigating the complex, exacting etiquette of who bowed to whom and in what order, though that mattered too, in its own way. It meant simply breathing the air you were given, in a building whose beauty had for a decade badly outpaced its basic function. The Queen of England lived in the grandest house in the world, and for the first years of her reign, that house was in ways both dramatic and quietly persistent, working against her. There is one further detail worth sitting with here, because it speaks to just how severe the palace's sanitation problems truly were, and how carefully that severity was managed away from public view. At some point during the 1,840 seconds, officials commissioned a formal report examining the state of the palace's drainage and sanitation, the kind of technical assessment that any large institution might reasonably commission. What the investigators found was, by every surviving account, so damning, so thoroughly damaging to the image of royal grandeur that the monarchy depended upon, that the report itself was suppressed, kept from public circulation, its specific findings never allowed to reach the ordinary subjects whose taxes helped fund the palace's upkeep. We do not know, in precise detail, everything that report contained. That is, in a sense, entire point of a suppression. But we know enough, from the surrounding evidence, the accounts of servants like Sarah, the recorded complaints of courtiers, the eventual scale of Albert's reforms, to understand the general shape of what those investigators must have found. A system of waste management wholly inadequate to the household it served, contamination risks serious enough to alarm anyone with genuine medical or engineering knowledge. A palace that beneath its gilded surface was failing its most basic obligation to the people who lived within it, royal and servant alike. Consider for a moment the specific strangeness of that suppression. In an era when London itself was grappling publicly with the catastrophic state of its sanitation, when the Thames grew so foul with untreated waste that it would, within a few decades, force Parliament itself to suspend its sessions during the worst of the summer heat. Hidden from the very public whose taxes sustained the institution. The empire that prided itself on projecting order, civilization, and mastery over the natural world to the rest of the globe, could not, in its own most symbolic building, keep its own waste properly contained, and it chose concealment over honest acknowledgement. Victoria herself, in the private letters and journal entries that survive from these years, offers glimpses of her own frustration with conditions that her public role required her to endure largely in silence. She wrote on more than one occasion of the persistent cold in her apartments, of drafts that no amount of fire tending seemed able to fully banish, complaints that read on the page less like the grievances of an empress and more like the ordinary frustrations of anyone living in a poorly maintained home. There is something quietly humanizing in this, a reminder that behind the enormous formal weight of her position, Victoria experienced her own palace in much the same immediate physical way that Sarah did. Cold hands, a smell that would not fully clear, a building that, however magnificent its public rooms, could not always deliver the basic comfort its residents had every reason to expect. This is not a detail the popular imagination tends to preserve. We remember Victoria as an empress, a figure of enormous formal power, draped in black for the decades of mourning that followed Albert's death, the face on coins and stamps across a quarter of the globe. We do not typically remember her complaining about drafts or enduring the smell of her own palace's failing drains, or relying on a young husband's patient administrative reforms to finally make her own home livable in the most basic physical sense. But that too was Victoria's early reign, as real and as consequential in its own quiet way as any treaty or coronation. Let us spend a little longer with Sarah, because her life outside the palace's walls, brief and modest as her surviving traces are, deserves its own quiet attention tonight. Sarah was born in 1817 in a small village in Kent, the third of 5 children in a family of modest tenant farmers who worked land they did not own, paying rent to a landlord whose name appeared more often in their household's accounts. Her childhood, like the childhoods of most girls of her class and era, was one of early expected labor, helping her mother with the endless work of a farming household, learning to cook, to sew, to manage a household's small economies long before she was old enough to fully understand why any of it mattered. She received a modest education, enough to read simply and write a passable hand, delivered in fits and starts through the local parish school whenever the family could spare her from her duties at home. She entered domestic service at 12, as was common for girls in her circumstances, first in a smaller household in the nearby town, learning the basic disciplines of housework under the supervision of an older, more experienced housekeeper who was, by Sarah's own later recollection, it was through a cousin already employed in London, a young man who had secured a position as an undergroom in the royal stables, that Sarah first heard of an opening for a junior housemaid within the newly staffed household of the young queen, and it was this connection, this thin thread of family relation stretching from a Kent farmhouse to the gates of Buckingham Palace, that carried her into the story we have spent this evening exploring. She kept, throughout her years of service, a small collection of personal items that tell us something of who she was beyond her working duties. The wooden sewing box that belonged to her mother, its lid carved with leaves worn smooth by decades of handling. A handful of letters from her family in Kent, read and reread until their creases softened into something closer to fabric than paper. And, added sometime in her later years of service, a small, cheaply printed engraving of the Queen, purchased from a street vendor near the palace gates, which she kept tucked among her few possessions with a quiet private pride that she rarely spoke of, but that colored, in subtle ways, how she carried herself within the household she served. She never married during her years at the palace, a choice that was in part simple circumstance, the demanding schedule of palace service, leaving little room for courtship, and in part, as she confided many years later to a niece who eventually recorded some fragments of her recollections. Genuine contentment with the specific life she had built for herself. She found, within the rigid hierarchical structure of the royal household, a kind of stability and purpose that the uncertain economics of farm labor back in Kent could never have offered her family. Her wages, modest by the standards of the aristocracy she served, but truly substantial by the standards of her own family's circumstances, allowed her to send money home regularly, contributing in small but meaningful ways to her younger siblings' education and eventual prospects. There is something worth noting in this, a pattern that repeats across countless lives like Sarah's, largely invisible in the grand historical record, but essential to understanding how institutions like Buckingham Palace actually functioned. The palace was not merely a royal residence, but it was also, for hundreds of people like Sarah, a genuine economic opportunity, a path out of the precarious tenant farming that defined her family's circumstances, purchased at the cost of grueling labor, cramped quarters, and years spent breathing air that in the palace's earliest and worst years. She endured the conditions we have spent this evening describing, not because she had no choice in any absolute sense, but because the alternative, a life of similar hardship back in Kent, without even the modest wages and eventual security that palace service provided, offered little genuine improvement. Let us return briefly to the strange case of the boy Jones, because his eventual fate offers a fitting melancholy coda to the security failures we discussed earlier, and it deserves a fuller telling than we gave it before. Following his final, most alarming intrusion, the discovery beneath the Queen's sofa in December of 1840, the authorities faced a genuine dilemma. Jones's crimes, strange and alarming as they were, did not fit neatly into the existing legal categories available to Victorian magistrates. He had not committed violence. He had not, in any conventional sense, stolen anything of significant monetary value, undergarments and food scraps, hardly constituting grand larceny by the standards of the era's courts. And yet the sheer audacity and persistence of his intrusions demanded some response beyond the relatively toothless sentences he had already received. The solution the authorities settled upon was in its own way a quiet acknowledgement of the legal system's limitations. Jones was effectively pressed into naval service, removed from London, and placed aboard a series of Royal Navy vessels, a resolution that functioned less as formal punishment and more as an attempt to simply relocate the problem beyond the reach of Buckingham Palace's gates. He served over the following months on ships including the Warspite, the Inconstant and the Harlequin, a young man whose entire claim to notoriety rested on an obsessive fixation with a queen he would now spend years physically separated from by the width of open ocean. It did not entirely work. Jones deserted his post at one point, making his way back toward London in what authorities and newspapers like assumed was an attempt to return to the palace that had so thoroughly captured his imagination. He was apprehended before he could complete whatever journey he had intended, his notoriety by this point so widespread that authorities recognized him and returned him to naval custody before he ever came close to the gates he had once slipped through so easily. His life after naval service drifted, by most surviving accounts, toward difficulty and obscurity. He eventually emigrated to Australia, where the fragmentary records that survive describe a troubled existence marked by alcoholism and occasional brushes with the law, a far cry from the strange, almost celebrity status his palace intrusions had briefly granted him in the London press. In 1880, seeking to escape the reputation that had followed him across the world, he adopted a new name, attempting, in whatever way was available to a man of his limited means and diminished prospects, to leave the boy Jones behind entirely. He disappears from the historical record sometime in the final years of the 19th century, his exact death date lost to the same fragmentary record-keeping that obscures so many lives lived outside the attention of the wealthy and powerful. There is something quietly sad in this ending, beneath the strange, almost comic details that make his story so memorable. A boy whose singular, inexplicable fixation briefly made him one of the most talked about figures in London, whose case forced genuine reform upon one of the most powerful institutions in the world, ultimately faded into the same kind of obscurity. His name survives today primarily as an anecdote, a strange footnote in the history of royal security, rather than as the story of an actual person whose life, however strange its shape, held its own weight and consequence. To understand why Buckingham Palace's sanitation problems were in some ways almost inevitable given the era, it helps to step back and look at the broader condition of London itself during these same years, because the palace's failures were not some strange, isolated anomaly. They were in many respects simply the grandest and most visible example of a city-wide crisis. London, the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds, was a city fundamentally unprepared for its own scale. The population had grown explosively across the preceding decades, drawn by the opportunities of industrialization, and the infrastructure built to serve a smaller, earlier city simply could not keep pace. Across London, an estimated 200,000 cesspools served a population that had long since outgrown the capacity of individual pits to safely contain and process human waste. The Thames itself, which received much of what those overwhelmed systems could not contain, grew progressively fouler across these decades. A slow-motion crisis that would eventually culminate in 1858 in what London newspapers of the time dubbed the Great Stink, a summer heat wave so severe that the smell rising from the river became strong enough to force Parliament to consider abandoning its own riverside chambers. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime hung in a desperate, largely futile attempt to mask the stench. Buckingham Palace's sanitation failures, then, were not an aberration from London's broader condition. They were, in a sense, a microcosm of it. The same fundamental problem, waste management infrastructure, inadequate to a population that had grown beyond its design, playing out behind palace walls with the same basic mechanics that afflicted ordinary London households, simply with more elaborate architecture wrapped around the same failing plumbing. This context matters because it helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange. Why did it take so long, years rather than months, for even a palace with essentially unlimited resources to address these problems? Part of the answer lies in the household's chaotic management structure, which we have already discussed at length. But part of the answer lies in something larger, a simple truth about the era itself. The specific engineering knowledge required to properly solve large-scale sanitation problems, the understanding of how waterborne disease actually spread, the proper design principles for drainage systems capable of serving buildings and populations of this scale, was still, in the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds, only just emerging. The germ theory of disease, which would eventually explain precisely why contaminated water and waste posed such a direct threat to human health, remained decades away from general acceptance. Doctors and engineers of this era worked for the most part from the same flawed miasma theory that shaped medical thinking across so much of the era, the belief that disease spread primarily through foul-smelling air rather than through the specific, identifiable pathogens that we now understand cause illnesses like typhoid and cholera. This does not excuse the suppression of that damning sanitation report, or the years of delay before Albert's reforms finally began in earnest. But it does help explain why even the wealthiest, most powerful institution in Britain struggled for so long to solve a problem that seems, from our modern vantage point with our modern understanding of sanitation engineering, almost embarrassingly basic. They were working, in a very real sense, with incomplete maps, trying to solve a problem whose true nature they could not yet fully perceive. Within the palace itself, the daily rhythms of household life continued through all of this, structured by a hierarchy that Sarah and her fellow servants navigated with the same careful attention to status and precedents that governed the aristocracy above them, simply translated to different terms. At the top of the domestic staff sat the housekeeper, a position of genuine authority and respect within the household, responsible for supervising the maids, managing the linen and provision stores, and maintaining the general standard of cleanliness and order throughout the palace's residential quarters. Beneath her, a graduated hierarchy of housemaids, still roommaids, and scullery workers, each with clearly defined responsibilities and, crucially, clearly defined limits on which areas of the palace they were permitted to enter and which tasks fell properly. This hierarchy, rigid as it could sometimes feel to those navigating it, provided a kind of stability that Sarah, in her more reflective moments, came to deeply value. It offered a clear path, however slow, toward greater responsibility and better wages, a structure of advancement that the uncertain economics of her family's tenant farming back in Kent could never have provided. And it offered, too, a sense of belonging, a community of women who understood, in ways that no one outside the palace's working ranks could quite grasp, the specific texture of a life spent maintaining grandeur that they themselves rarely had occasion to fully enjoy. Before we turn to the birth of the Queen's first child, there is an earlier scene worth visiting, because it marks the first great test of the palace's readiness to serve as the ceremonial heart of the monarchy, and it arrived less than a year after Victoria first moved through its unfinished doors. In June of 1838, Victoria became the first British sovereign in history to depart from Buckingham Palace for her own coronation, a procession that would carry her through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey in a display of pageantry. Every window and rooftop along the route packed with spectators eager for a glimpse of their young queen. Within the palace itself, in the days and hours preceding this departure, the household's chronic disorganization was tested against a demand for perfection that it was, by any honest measure, not yet fully prepared to meet. Sarah, not yet a year into her service at the time, recalled the coronation preparations as among the most frantic and exhausting stretches of her early career, a period when the household's usual muddled inefficiency collided directly with the absolute necessity that every room the Queen might pass through. Every detail of her departure appeared flawless to the thousands of eyes that would be watching. Housemaids worked through the night in the days before the ceremony, polishing surfaces that would never actually be seen by the crowds outside, correcting small failures wherever they could be corrected, and simply managing around the ones that could not. The coronation procession itself, when it finally departed the palace gates on the morning of the 28th of June, represented in its way the same fundamental tension we have traced throughout tonight's story. From the street, from the crowds, cheering as the Golden State coach carried their 18-year-old queen toward Westminster, Buckingham Palace appeared exactly as its architects had intended, majestic, permanent, the unshakable seat of an empire's power. Inside those same walls, in the hours before that departure, servants had been fighting, as they fought nearly every day, against drains that would not properly drain and fires that would not properly draw, managing the gap between appearance and function so that the Queen's grandest public moment. Victoria herself, in the private account she kept of that day, described her coronation with the particular, breathless enthusiasm of a young woman experiencing one of the defining moments of her life, the weight of the crown, the swell of the Abbey's music, the overwhelming sense of the crowds who had come to witness her ascension made real. She makes no mention, in these private reflections, of the palace's ongoing structural failures, no acknowledgement of the frantic effort that had gone into presenting her departure so seamlessly. This too is worth noting, a reminder that the invisible labor propping up the visible performance of monarchy was, by design, meant to remain invisible even to the monarch herself, who experienced her own coronation as a moment of pure, uncomplicated triumph, precisely because so many people like Sarah had spent the preceding nights ensuring that nothing would interrupt it. It is worth returning, for a moment, to the specific mechanics of what Albert's engineers actually did to the palace's failing systems, because the technical detail of the solution matters as much as the broader administrative story surrounding it. The cesspools beneath the palace, some of them decades old, inherited from the earlier, smaller Buckingham House and never properly modernized as the building above them grew, were systematically excavated, laborious and thoroughly unpleasant undertaking that required workmen to descend into pits that had been accumulating waste for years, in some cases for generations. The old, inadequate structures were removed entirely rather than merely repaired, replaced with a properly engineered drainage system designed according to the emerging understanding of how waste should actually be conveyed away from a building rather than simply contained beneath it. This distinction between containment and conveyance represents one of the genuine engineering advances of the era, a shift away from the ancient assumption that waste could simply be collected and periodically removed by hand, toward the modern understanding that waste needed to be continuously carried away through properly sealed, moving by gravity toward a point of disposal well beyond the building it served. The old cesspool system, however large or well constructed, was always going to fail eventually, because it was fighting against an ever-growing accumulation with no genuine mechanism for ongoing removal. The new system Albert commissioned worked with the physics of drainage rather than against it, and this fundamental shift in approach, more than any single repair, explains why the improvements held in a way that decades of previous patchwork repair never had. The gas lighting system received a comparably thorough overhaul. Engineers traced the network of pipes running through the palace's walls and beneath its floors, identifying and resealing the joints most prone to leaking, and critically improving the ventilation of rooms where gas fixtures were installed, ensuring that any residual leakage, however minor, had somewhere to safely disperse, rather than accumulating in enclosed spaces. This was not a perfect solution. Gaslighting throughout the Victorian era remained, by modern standards, a persistently imperfect technology, and Buckingham Palace would continue experiencing occasional gas-related problems for decades to come, alongside every other gaslit building of the era. But the acute, dangerous leaking that had characterized the palace's earliest years of gas installation was substantially reduced, the ceilings blackening more slowly, the air carrying less of the sulphurous tang that had once been so pronounced in the staterooms during Victoria's earliest winters there. The chimneys presented, in some respects, the most stubborn engineering challenge of all, because the downdraft problem that plagued so many of them was rooted in decisions made years earlier, in the original construction and subsequent modifications under Nash's chaotic supervision. The surrounding architecture, that could not always be easily undone without more invasive structural work than the household's budget or patience, could readily accommodate. Albert's engineers addressed what they could, adjusting flue caps, clearing blockages that had accumulated over years of inadequate maintenance, and in the most severe cases, undertaking more substantial reconstruction of specific chimneys that proved impossible to correct. Not every fireplace in the palace was fully corrected during these years. Some persistent smoking problems would linger for decades, addressed gradually as resources and priorities allowed. But the worst of the problem, the widespread, near-universal failure that had once forced servants to let fires die down rather than tolerate their smoke, was substantially brought under control. What strikes any modern reader examining the surviving accounts of this period is the sheer, patient persistence the work required. Albert did not simply issue a decree and watch the palace transform overnight. He spent years personally reviewing reports, meeting with engineers and household officials, tracking the progress of improvements, room by room, system by system, in a manner that speaks to a temperament well suited to the unglamorous, unheroic work of institutional repair. This was not the stuff of grand historical narrative, no dramatic confrontations, no sweeping proclamations. It was the accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions correctly made, consistently followed through across years of patient attention that few outside the household's own working ranks ever fully witnessed or appreciated. Before Albert's reforms had properly taken hold, though the palace's gas system produced at least one incident, severe enough to alarm even the household's most weary, long-serving staff. And it is worth pausing on, because it illustrates just how truly dangerous the building's unaddressed failures could become. It occurred in the winter of 1839, in a smaller drawing room on one of the palace's middle floors, a room that had been closed for several days while minor repairs were undertaken elsewhere in that section of the building. When a footman finally opened the door to check on the room's readiness, he was met with an atmosphere so thick with the unmistakable sulphurous odor of leaking coal gas that he immediately withdrew, calling for assistance rather than proceeding further inside. A gas fitting somewhere within the room's walls had apparently been leaking steadily throughout the days. The room stood closed and unventilated, the gas accumulating with nowhere to escape, no open window, no draft, no circulation of any kind to disperse it. The response, once the danger was recognized, moved with an urgency that the palace's usual languid pace of household management rarely displayed. Windows were forced open despite their notorious tendency to stick. Doors were propped wide to encourage whatever circulation the building's poor ventilation could manage. Servants were instructed to avoid the area entirely until the room had been thoroughly aired, a process that, by the accounts that survive, took the better part of a full day before anyone judged it safe to bring an open flame anywhere near the space again. Given the very real risk that accumulated gas of this concentration could have ignited with catastrophic consequences. Sarah, though not directly involved in managing this particular incident, recalled the unusual anxious energy that moved through the household's lower ranks in its aftermath, the kind of collective unspoken understanding, narrowly averted only by the fortunate timing of a footman's routine check, rather than by any deliberate safety measure the household had thought to put in place. No one, as far as the surviving records indicate, was seriously harmed by this particular leak. But the incident lingered in the collective memory of the staff who lived through it. A stark physical reminder that the vague, generalized unease many of them already felt about the palace's gas installations was not mere superstition or exaggeration. The danger was real, and it had come, on this winter day, closer to catastrophe than anyone in the household cared to fully acknowledge. This is the kind of incident that rarely survives in the grand historical record, absent from the formal accounts of royal life that focus on ceremonies and successions and matters of state. It exists only in the fragmentary memory of servants like Sarah, passed down through the kind of oral history that domestic staff shared among themselves, a private, largely unrecorded knowledge of just how close the palace's failures had occasionally come to genuine tragedy. The unshakable facade that greeted every visitor who approached from the street. Let us pause on one particular moment from these years, because it draws together several threads of tonight's story into a single, vivid scene. The birth of the Queen's first child in November of 1840, just 10 days before the boy Jones was discovered beneath her sofa. The palace in the days surrounding a royal birth transformed into something closer to a small, self-contained bureaucracy than an ordinary household. Tradition, stretching back centuries, required that senior government officials be present somewhere within the palace at the moment of delivery, a practice intended to guarantee beyond any possible doubt the legitimacy of the royal succession. On the 21st of November, 1840, as Victoria's labour began, members of the Privy Council gathered in rooms near her private apartments, waiting through the hours of a process that, for all the grandeur of its royal setting, remained exactly as physically demanding and uncertain. Sarah, in her account of these years, recalled the specific hush that settled over the palace's working corridors during those hours. Servants moving with unusual quiet, conversations dropping to murmurs, as though the entire building understood, at some instinctive level, the weight of what was unfolding in the Queen's private rooms. When word finally spread that the child had arrived safely, a girl whom the Queen and her husband would name Victoria after her mother, the relief that moved through the household's lower ranks was, by every surviving account, genuine and considerable. Whatever private disappointment may have accompanied the news that the long-awaited heir would need to wait for a future pregnancy, the christening that followed, conducted with the full ceremonial weight that royal tradition demanded, required the mobilization of nearly every department within the palace's sprawling household. From the kitchens preparing an elaborate celebratory feast to the housemaids ensuring that every room the assembled dignitaries might pass through met the exacting standard that such an occasion required. Sarah spent the days surrounding the christening in a blur of preparation, polishing, arranging, and, in her own small corner of the household's vast machinery, ensuring that the specific rooms under her care carried no trace of the persistent sanitation problems that still, in November of 1840, occasionally announced themselves at the worst possible moments. It is a strange thing in retrospect to consider that the same week which brought the palace this moment of genuine celebration, the safe arrival of the Queen's first child, also brought the security failure that would finally force Albert's reforms into motion. Two threads of the same story, arriving within days of each other, one representing the continuation of a dynasty, and the other representing the persistent, embarrassing vulnerability of the building. History rarely arranges its lessons so neatly, but here, in the closing weeks of 1840, it very nearly did. The broader story of London's sanitation, which Buckingham Palace's own struggles so closely mirrored, would eventually find its resolution in the work of an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, though that resolution lay decades beyond the years we have spent this evening exploring. Following the Great Stink of 1858, the crisis severe enough to finally force Parliament's hand, Bazalgette was commissioned to design and build a comprehensive sewer network for the entire city, a system of tunnels and pumping stations that would, over the following decade, finally carry London's waste safely away from the city centre and the river that ran through it. His network, remarkably, remains in use today, still carrying the waste of a city that has grown many times larger than the one Bazalgette originally designed for, a testament to engineering foresight that Buckingham Palace's own patchwork Victorian repairs. Albert did not live to see Bazalgette's full network completed, though the broader public health reforms of the era Sanitation Acts, improved understanding of disease transmission, growing investment in proper drainage infrastructure across the country, unfolded during the very years he was quietly transforming Buckingham Palace's own systems. He was, in this sense, part of a broader current of change moving through Victorian Britain, a period when the gap between the era's technological ambition and its basic public health infrastructure was finally, slowly, being closed. There is a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the same forces reshaping London's relationship with its own waste were, simultaneously, reshaping the palace at its centre, even if the connection between the two. Buckingham Palace, for all its unique history and singular grandeur, was never truly separate from the city surrounding it. It shared London's water, London's air, and, for the better part of a century, London's fundamental struggle to build infrastructure equal to the scale of what it had become. Let us imagine, for a moment, one specific evening from Victoria's own perspective, drawn from the fragments of complaint and observation that survive in her private writings from these years, because it offers a different vantage point on everything we have discussed tonight. One grounded not in the servants' quarters, but in the Queen's own private apartments. It is a January evening in 1838, not long after Victoria's 18th birthday, and the young Queen sits at her writing desk in her private sitting room, a shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders despite the fire burning, or attempting to burn, in the grate nearby. The fire smokes rather than warms, the same downdraft that plagues so many of the palace's chimneys, filling the room with a faint grey haze that stings her eyes, leaves the air tasting faintly of ash. She has already sent for a servant twice this evening, once to attend to the fire, and once, with a note of genuine irritation, entering her private correspondence to inquire why her sitting room remains so persistently cold despite the season's demands for adequate heating. She writes a letter to her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, whose advice and correspondence she relies upon heavily in these early uncertain years of her reign, of her frustration with a palace that seems, in her own words, incapable of providing the basic comfort she had reasonably expected upon becoming its mistress. The complaint is brief, almost dismissive in tone, tucked between more weighty matters of state and family, but it carries beneath its formal phrasing the genuine unglamorous frustration of a young woman shivering in her own home. This is worth sitting with because it complicates the image we so often carry of Victoria in these years, the young Queen, radiant with new authority, delighting in balls and the social whirl of her position. That image is not false. But it existed alongside evenings like this one, evenings of cold hands and smoking fires, and a persistent low-grade irritation with a building that had not yet learned to properly serve the young woman now responsible for it. Power, in this specific and unglamorous sense, did not insulate Victoria from discomfort. It simply meant that her discomfort played out against a backdrop of unimaginable wealth, which made the persistence of that discomfort all the more striking to anyone who paused to consider it. She would, within a few short years, marry a man whose particular genius lay precisely in solving exactly this kind of problem, patiently, systematically, without ever losing sight of the practical, physical needs of the people, royal and servant alike, who depended upon the palace functioning properly. But in January of 1838, sitting at her desk with a shawl drawn tight against a fire that would not properly warm her, Victoria could not yet know that her future husband would spend years of his life correcting the very failures she was, in this quiet private moment, simply enduring. The fifth and final pattern worth naming tonight, before we return to Sarah and close this evening together, is the strange persistent way that history repeats its own lessons across generations who believe themselves entirely modern. Consider the full arc we have traced tonight, a palace built too quickly, too expensively, under a king more concerned with grandeur than function. A young queen who inherits that grandeur without inheriting the resources or authority to properly fix what lies broken beneath it. A husband who spends years of patient, unglamorous, labor-correcting failures that no one before him had possessed the standing or the will to address. And then, nearly 2 centuries later, a new generation of royal administrators, facing essentially the same underlying problem, aging infrastructure that grandeur alone cannot sustain, forced once again into a lengthy, expensive, unglamorous program of repair. The specific technologies change. Cesspools give way to modern sewers, coal gas gives way to electricity, and electricity itself must eventually be rewired to standards that would have seemed like magic to anyone standing in Victoria's smoking sitting room in January of 1838. But the underlying pattern, grandeur outpacing infrastructure, appearance outpacing function, remains remarkably constant. Every generation that inherits a great building inherits, alongside its beauty, the accumulated weight of every previous generation's compromises, patches, and deferred repairs. Buckingham Palace has taught this lesson at least twice now, once to a young queen shivering in her own home, and once to a modern monarchy forced to acknowledge that even the most famous address on earth cannot simply project permanence without periodically, painfully, rebuilding the parts no visitor ever sees. Let us return one final time to Sarah, because it is now the autumn of 1858, and she is 61 years old, and this quiet, ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way except that it is the last one we will spend with her tonight, deserves the same careful attention we have given to everything else in this story. Sarah retired from active palace service some years ago. Her advancing age and the accumulated physical toll of 4 decades in domestic service finally making the daily demands of the work more than her body could comfortably sustain. She lives now in a small cottage on the outskirts of London, purchased with the careful savings of a lifetime spent in royal service. A modest but genuinely comfortable home that would have seemed to the 20-year-old housemaid who first arrived at Buckingham Palace's gates in 1837 like something close to an impossible luxury. The cottage has its own small hearth, and on this particular October evening, the fire burns cleanly, drawing its smoke properly up through a chimney that has never once, in all the years Sarah has lived here, filled her small sitting room with the choking grey haze she remembers so vividly from her earliest years at the palace. There is something she still notices about this, even now, a small, private satisfaction in watching a fire simply do what a fire is supposed to do, warming a room without punishing the person who lit it. It is the kind of thing that only someone who spent years fighting against exactly this failure can properly appreciate, an ordinary comfort that most people never think to be grateful for because they have never known its absence. She keeps, on a shelf near her small writing desk, the same wooden sewing box that belonged to her mother, its carved leaves worn even smoother now by the additional decades of handling. Beside it sits the small engraving of the Queen she purchased so many years ago from a street vendor near the palace gates, its edges softened and slightly yellowed with age. A modest keepsake from a life spent, however invisibly, in service to the young woman Sarah has followed, across these years, the broader arc of the royal family's fortunes with the exact personal interest of someone who spent decades inside their household, even as her own direct connection to that world has grown more distant with each passing year. She knows from the newspapers and from the occasional letter she still receives from friends remaining in service that the palace she once called her working home has changed almost beyond recognition from the building she first entered as a frightened, exhausted 20-year-old. The drains that once regularly backed up into the kitchens have been thoroughly rebuilt. The gas lamps burn reliably, now their leaks patched and their maintenance properly managed. The chaotic, overlapping departments that once left basic questions of household management unanswered for years have given way to the clearer, more accountable structure that Prince Albert spent so much of his life establishing. She thinks, on this particular evening, of Albert himself, who died nearly 3 years ago now, in December of 1861, a loss that the newspapers described in terms of genuine national mourning, the Queen herself reportedly retreating into a grief so profound that she has, by most accounts Sarah has read, scarcely appeared in public since. Sarah remembers him not as the grand historical figure the newspapers describe, the great modernizer, the prince who transformed the monarchy's relationship to science and industry and public life. She remembers him as the quiet, methodical presence whose reforms, unfolding gradually across her middle years of service, made her own daily labor measurably easier, her own working conditions measurably safer, in ways that she experienced not as abstract historical progress. Physical relief of hands that cracked less often from cold water, and lungs that burn less often from wood smoke. There is a certain kind of gratitude that settles in a person only after enough time has passed to properly measure what has changed. And Sarah, sitting by her clean-burning fire on this quiet October evening, feels the full weight of it now, decades after the fact. She thinks of her younger self, a girl who knelt at countless hearths throughout the palace's lower and middle floors, feeding flames that so often refused to properly draw, breathing air that so often carried the unmistakable trace of a building's failing plumbing. That girl could not have imagined, in her most hopeful moments, the specific, mundane comfort of a fire that simply works, in a home that is entirely, unambiguously her own. She rises eventually, as the evening deepens toward full dark, to bank the fire for the night. An old habit from her years of service that she has never fully unlearned, the careful, practiced motion of ensuring the coals will hold their warmth until morning. She moves through her small cottage with the same quiet efficiency that once carried her through the vast, echoing corridors of Buckingham Palace, though now there is no one to serve but herself. No bells to answer, no grand household above her whose comfort depends upon her labor. Outside, the London evening has settled into its familiar autumn chill, and somewhere across the city, in rooms Sarah will never enter again, the palace she once called home continues its long, patient transformation from the beautiful, failing building she first encountered into something closer to what its facade had always promised. The work is not finished, not in 1858, not for decades still to come, and Sarah, if she thinks about this at all, understands it with the specific clarity of someone who spent her working life inside an institution's slow, grand buildings, like grand lives, are never truly finished. They are simply, continuously tended. She settles into her chair by the banked fire, the wooden sewing box within easy reach, the small portrait of the Queen watching quietly from its shelf, and she allows herself, in this private, unremarkable moment, the simple pleasure of warmth without smoke, of a home that asks nothing more of her than to sit and rest, and let the evening pass. The fire has burned down to its last coals. The house is quiet. The street outside has gone dark and still, the exact stillness of a London evening settling into night. Sleep well, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight.